4 decades after he survived the crash that took the lives of 3 of his fellow Lynyrd Skynyrd bandmates.
October 20th at 6:30 is about the time that we went down.
The story of Lynyrd Skynyrd is one of the most compelling narratives in the annals of rock history. An American band defined by raw southern grit, guitar-heavy anthems, and tragic, untimely loss. Yet within the shadows of its legendary legacy has long lurked an unsolved mystery, one that has both haunted fans and puzzled historians for decades. Now, with a recent and utterly shocking development, that mystery has finally been solved, laying bare a truth more disturbing and astonishing than anyone had anticipated. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. It all stems from the infamous 1977 plane crash that decimated the band and changed the trajectory of rock forever. On October 20th that year, a Convair CV-240 carrying Lynyrd Skynyrd went down in a Mississippi forest just 3 days after the release of their album Street Survivors. The crash killed lead singer Ronnie Van Zant, guitarist Steve Gaines, backup singer Cassie Gaines, assistant road manager Dean Kilpatrick, and both pilots. Survivors were left with devastating injuries, both physical and emotional, but something else was left behind as well. A gaping hole in the timeline, a series of unanswered questions, and a baffling set of inconsistencies that never quite added up. For years, the crash was officially attributed to fuel exhaustion caused by crew error and mechanical misjudgments. But some close to the band always believed there was more to the story. Details that didn't fit with the official report or testimonies that contradicted each other. Fans obsessed over oddities. Why had the pilots ignored multiple warnings about fuel levels? Why was the aircraft's maintenance record murky at best? And perhaps most confusing, why had the band opted for a plane that had such a deeply questionable safety track record? Only fragments ever surfaced, bits of private testimonies, snippets of cockpit recordings, and half-whispered rumors about what had really occurred in those fateful final moments. Investigations would rise and fall, but with time, the mystery calcified into legend, growing in scope and intensity. Some claimed sabotage. Others suggested internal arguments within the band that led to irrational decisions. A few even floated the theory that someone wanted the band gone. But everything changed recently when an anonymous source came forward with a sealed collection of tapes and flight documents that had been long suppressed. These tapes, stored secretly for decades in a private collection, were verified through exhaustive cross-referencing with known materials and technological analysis. What they contained was not only revelatory, it was explosive. Among the materials was a full cockpit voice recording, far more complete than what had been publicly released, including the moments leading up to the final descent. It revealed a harrowing reality. The pilots were not just uninformed or negligent, they were misled. The plane's fuel gauges had been intentionally tampered with, providing false readings throughout the flight. This was no innocent oversight. It was a deliberate act of sabotage. The implications were staggering. An internal review conducted in secret shortly after the crash had apparently uncovered signs of foul play, but the findings were buried to avoid a media firestorm. According to documents found alongside the tapes, the airline's parent company feared legal annihilation and potential bankruptcy if the sabotage became public. So the blame was placed squarely on pilot error and poor mechanical upkeep. Convenient scapegoats in a tragedy that seemed almost tailor-made for conspiracy. Even more disturbing was the identity of the saboteur. The investigation unearthed links to a disgruntled former employee of the charter company, someone with technical access to the aircraft and a known history of unstable behavior. In a chilling twist, it appeared this individual had personal grievances not only with the airline but, bizarrely, with the band itself, blaming Lynyrd Skynyrd for moral corruption and cultural degradation, viewing their music as emblematic of a society spiraling into chaos. In a twisted, self-righteous vendetta, he had orchestrated a plan to bring the band down, quite literally. No one could have expected such a motive. It wasn't corporate greed or internal dissent, it was ideological extremism. This revelation cast the tragedy in an entirely new light. The loss of Van Zant and others was not just the result of bad luck or mismanagement, it was the outcome of a targeted act of violence. It wasn't just an accident, it was, by every definition, a crime. This knowledge rewrites the entire mythology of Lynyrd Skynyrd. For years, the band's story had been told as a tragic accident, rock and roll cut short by fate. Now it was rock and roll sabotaged by fanaticism. The romanticism around the band's demise, the poetic irony of dying on the road just as their star was rising higher than ever, has been replaced with a more sinister truth. It injects a new kind of horror into the already devastating event, and it prompts a broader reflection on the dangers of obsession, the volatility of fame, and the unpredictable intersections of culture and madness. This development also reopens questions about the band's awareness in those final moments. Did they suspect something was wrong beyond mechanical failure? Did any of the crew sense foul play? Portions of the newly revealed cockpit audio hint that at least one person aboard may have suspected sabotage. In a faint, scratchy portion of the tape, one of the engineers is heard murmuring about the fuel levels being not right, even though readings suggested otherwise. Another chilling line, "This doesn't make any sense," echoes moments before the engines fail completely. For the families and survivors, this revelation is both a vindication and a new source of trauma. It confirms long-held suspicions that something more sinister had been at play. But it also revives the pain of that night with fresh intensity, knowing that the crash was preventable, that it was the product of malevolent intent rather than cruel chance, adds a new dimension of grief. The shock reverberates beyond just the fans and families. It touches the entire music industry, stirring up long-dormant debates about artist safety, corporate accountability, and the hidden costs of fame. It forces reflection on how easily truth can be buried beneath bureaucracy, fear, and commercial interest. The fact that such critical evidence was hidden for decades, shielded behind legal walls and corporate self-preservation, raises troubling concerns about how many other truths have been obscured in the annals of entertainment history. Moreover, the revelation transforms the band's surviving legacy. Lynyrd Skynyrd's music, already saturated with themes of freedom, rebellion, and Southern pride, now carries an even deeper resonance. Songs like Freebird, once viewed as defiant hymns of individuality, now read almost prophetically, echoing with the eerie knowledge of a freedom stolen, a voice silenced not by fate, but by deliberate malice. This twist in the story will likely alter how future generations understand and interpret Lynyrd Skynyrd's place in cultural history. It cements their story not only as one of loss, but of injustice. Their music, already immortal, is now enshrined with the weight of martyrdom. The crash is no longer just a tragic endpoint, it's the centerpiece of a cautionary tale about trust, safety, and the dark shadows that sometimes lurk just behind the spotlight. For music historians and scholars, this discovery is akin to unlocking a vault of forgotten truths. It demands a reevaluation of not only the band's story, but the mechanisms that allowed such a cover-up to persist. It forces new scrutiny on aviation practices in the 1970s, the lax regulatory oversight that made such sabotage possible, and the moral compromises corporations made in the name of damage control. The documents include memos between executives discussing how to minimize reputational damage and control the narrative. Cold, calculated words that stand in stark contrast to the human cost of their decisions. There's also a psychological dimension to this revelation. The saboteur's motives, as outlined in a handwritten manifesto found among the materials, offer a glimpse into a deeply disturbed mind, someone who saw themselves not as a villain, but as a moral crusader. The manifesto is filled with bizarre ramblings about saving American youth and purging filth from the airwaves. It's disturbing in its clarity, showing just how far detached from reality one person can become when ideology curdles into delusion. That such a person could not only conceive of such an act but carry it out under the noses of an entire industry is sobering. It prompts uncomfortable questions about how many other vulnerabilities remain unnoticed. How many other acts of ideological extremism could be gestating in silence? It's a reminder that not all threats to artists come from fame's obvious trappings, substance abuse, burnout, or pressure, but sometimes from invisible adversaries hiding in plain sight. The implications of the mystery's resolution are profound. It is not merely about assigning blame or rewriting history. It's about acknowledging the reality of evil and the lengths to which it will go. It's about confronting the quiet failure of systems meant to protect artists and the dangerous complacency of assuming every tragedy is accidental. The revelation doesn't provide closure, it opens new wounds, new areas of inquiry, and a renewed urgency to protect those who create, inspire, and lead cultural movements. With the truth finally revealed, the full weight of the conspiracy surrounding Lynyrd Skynyrd's tragic crash has cast a longer, darker shadow than ever before. Yet beyond the immediate revelations lies a deeper labyrinth of implications, ones that stretch far into realms of psychological manipulation, industrial secrecy, and the fragility of public trust. What the tapes and documents unmasked was not just an isolated act of sabotage, but a stunning indictment of a system that, when tested, chose self-preservation over transparency. The air charter industry of the 1970s, particularly companies operating under looser federal oversight, functioned in a precarious balance between profit and peril. Though chartered flights were often the only way for touring musicians to maintain demanding schedules, safety protocols were inconsistent and documentation was notoriously erratic. Lynyrd Skynyrd had already dealt with multiple mechanical issues in previous flights, and according to lesser-known accounts, members of the band had voiced concerns just days before the fatal journey. With the saboteur now identified and his motivations exposed, the systemic breakdown that allowed his interference to go unnoticed has become all the more horrifying. Internal memos from the charter company show a stunning absence of security checks and a lax approach to technical inspections. Mechanics often relied on visual surveys rather than proper diagnostics. In this environment, it was possible, even easy, for someone with moderate knowledge of aircraft mechanics to manipulate gauges, reroute wiring, and mislead the crew. And this is precisely what happened. The saboteur exploited these vulnerabilities with surgical precision, counting on the industry's apathy to cover his tracks. In a particularly revealing document, one senior executive admitted, "Even if someone had caught the irregularities, they wouldn't have flagged it. We had no protocols for tampering." This absence of accountability extended beyond maintenance and into the broader culture of backstage operations in the music industry. The pressure to keep tours on track, costs low, and headlines positive created a climate where cutting corners was the norm rather than the exception. The aviation choices for the tour were influenced by convenience, price, and availability, not by reliability or safety. The company that owned the aircraft was not FAA certified to the same standard as major commercial airlines, yet it was entrusted with the lives of world-famous musicians and their crew. The sabotage wasn't the act of a genius mastermind. It didn't need to be. It was, in many ways, a crime enabled by collective negligence, a fatal symptom of an industry so focused on image and expedience that it failed to recognize its own vulnerabilities. The knowledge that something so preventable was allowed to happen has triggered waves of introspection across sectors, especially among aviation regulatory bodies and artist management firms. It forces an uncomfortable question. If a saboteur could act so easily in one of rock's most documented tragedies, how many other such incidents have gone unrecognized? Further analysis of the sealed documents uncovered a disturbing post-crash cover-up protocol, designed by legal teams to insulate not just the airline but associated stakeholders. This involved coordinated statements, suppression of evidence, and carefully coached testimonies that omitted any references to inconsistencies in the aircraft's instruments. In one internal communication between executives and legal counsel, there was an explicit directive. Avoid all discussions related to mechanical tampering, establish pilot fatigue and fuel miscalculation as the sole narrative. This wasn't just a narrative, it was a script. A darker layer to the mystery lies in the psychological aftermath experienced by survivors, many of whom, despite the passage of time, had lingering doubts about what they experienced that night. They weren't simply mourning the deaths of friends and bandmates. They were wrestling with half-remembered sensations of dread, broken communication, and confusion that didn't fit the official explanation. These feelings were often dismissed as trauma-induced distortion, but now they've been validated. Survivors weren't paranoid. They were perceptive. Revelations of this magnitude inevitably trigger a reevaluation of memory and legacy. The members who perished, Ronnie Van Zant, Steve Gaines, Cassie Gaines, are no longer simply victims of bad luck or mechanical failure. They are victims of a calculated, premeditated act that rendered them unwilling martyrs in a war they didn't even know they were fighting. That changes the essence of how they are remembered. Their deaths were not just tragic, they were unjust. They represent the culmination of systemic failures and unchecked obsession. And the figure at the center of it all, the saboteur, was not unknown to authorities. Police reports show he had a documented history of mental instability, including threats made to radio stations that played profane rock music. A former airline employee, he had just enough technical training to be dangerous, and a personal manifesto filled with twisted logic about purging cultural filth. He saw Lynyrd Skynyrd not as artists, but as symbols of a cultural decline he believed needed to be violently corrected. His hatred was not personal in the traditional sense. It was symbolic. To him, the band represented everything wrong with modern America, and their destruction was, in his mind, a necessary act of moral warfare. That ideology, once dismissed as lunatic fringe, finds eerie resonance today in the age of polarization, extremism, and weaponized narratives. The saboteur's reasoning, grotesque as it was, underscores how dangerous the convergence of ideology and technical knowledge can be. It's a chilling reminder that the line between belief and violence can be dangerously thin when left unchecked. With the tapes authenticated and the documents corroborated, a wave of legal and ethical questions now looms. Though the statute of limitations prevents prosecution in most aspects of the case, the role of corporations in burying the truth may not be so easily shielded. Legal scholars are already debating whether new civil actions could be brought forward by surviving relatives or estates, particularly if the suppression of evidence can be proven to have caused emotional or financial harm. While the saboteur himself is deceased, the corporate actors who concealed the crime may still be held accountable in the court of public opinion, if not in legal proceedings. For those who grew up with Lynyrd Skynyrd's music as the soundtrack of rebellion, freedom, and Southern pride, the new revelations are emotionally jarring. The band's gritty lyrics and blues-soaked riffs always spoke of struggle, defiance, and the fleeting nature of life. But now, those themes are imbued with a haunting authenticity. When Ronnie Van Zant sang about being a simple man, fans heard humility. Now they hear a man walking unknowingly toward betrayal. This event also adds depth to the eerie coincidence surrounding the Street Survivors album cover, originally featuring the band engulfed in flames, released just days before the crash. The cover was pulled and replaced after the tragedy, but in the context of recent discoveries, it feels like a ghastly premonition, a visual metaphor for the inferno of conspiracy and silence that would consume their legacy for decades. What once seemed like an unfortunate juxtaposition now reads like an accidental omen. The implications ripple outward, not only affecting how we see Skynyrd's story, but how we understand the machinery behind celebrity and spectacle. The entertainment industry's thirst for endless performance often overrides considerations of sustainability and safety. Musicians are expected to remain constantly in motion. Touring, promoting, recording, rarely afforded the time or bandwidth to assess the risks around them. The Lynyrd Skynyrd mystery shows what happens when that inertia collides with negligence and unmonitored hatred. The complexity of this story lies in its many contradictions. It's a tale of stardom and obscurity, of music that touched millions and a crime that was hidden for decades. It's about a band that symbolized freedom, undone by control. It's about memory twisted by deception, only to be straightened years later by truth. And above all, it's about the vulnerability of even the most iconic figures to forces beyond their stage and their songs. Looking ahead, the story is far from over. This newfound clarity has spurred renewed calls for archival transparency in both the music and aviation industries. Advocates are pushing for legislation that would make it mandatory to preserve all technical records associated with aviation incidents involving public figures, and to release cockpit recordings in full, not just in curated snippets. Transparency, they argue, must not be treated as a liability, but as a moral imperative. Only by understanding the full scope of what happened can similar tragedies be prevented. There's also a movement growing to formally honor the legacy of the band members, not just as artists, but as victims of a profound injustice. Proposals include establishing educational programs that teach about media literacy, psychological profiling, and the dangers of ideological radicalization. Others want a physical memorial erected at the crash site, not just in remembrance of the lives lost, but as a testament to the hidden dangers that took them. The idea is not to romanticize the tragedy, but to extract lessons from it. Harsh, painful lessons that could one day save lives. As more people digest the full breadth of what's been uncovered, Lynyrd Skynyrd's music takes on a new dimension. It becomes not just art, but testimony. Each track stands as both a creation and a cry, from the slide guitars of Tuesday's Gone to the defiant swagger of Gimme 3 Steps. Every note is now layered with meaning forged in the fires of betrayal and loss. The music hasn't changed, but the silence between the notes has. The fact that this truth remained hidden for nearly half a century also speaks to the deep psychological need people have for neat narratives. Messy truths are inconvenient. They make people uncomfortable. They challenge institutions. The idea that a beloved band was destroyed by something as insidious as ideological sabotage didn't fit the clean lines of a rock tragedy. It felt too dark, too cynical, too unbelievable, so it was ignored. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us? What are your thoughts on the Lynyrd Skynyrd mystery finally being solved? Shocking or expected? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.